The harems of the Ottoman Empire, a subject which, while evoking images of scantily dressed nubile young women, also deals with power, prestige, war, tradition, and ultimately the fate of an empire. Historical records from the West from the time of the Ottomans are skewed and biased, often inaccurate, as few Europeans ever had first-hand experience with the Sultan's harem. Actually, that isn't quite true. There were any number of Europeans, Africans, and Eurasians that were very involved with the Imperial Harem, although rarely was this a willing and mutually beneficial arrangement. The Ottoman Empire was a very inclusive yet traditional place. It should be noted that the Ottoman Empire didn't create the idea of harems. The latest in the long line of Mesopotamian empires, the Ottomans inherited practices of their predecessors. The empire was set up under Islamic rule and carried the title of Caliphate, essentially the center and protector of Islam. The Ottomans were also heavily influenced by the conquest and incorporation of Constantinople, eventually renamed Istanbul in the 20th century. The empire was remarkably stable and long-lived, with almost no civil wars or widespread internal conflict. A large contributor to this was the Imperial Harem and the laws and rules surrounding it. If you think we are just interested in beautiful dancing harem girls, check out our other videos which cover a wide selection of history. From ancient humans to modern times, we cover it all. And like and subscribe to A Day in History to keep current on our new videos. The Ottoman Empire began in the 13th century with Osman I. Gaining land and power, the Ottomans, named after Osman via anglicization and some language hopping, would soon conquer the ancient city of Constantinople. This would bring about an influx of Greek and Roman culture that was the backbone of the Byzantines. The Ottoman Empire reached far and wide, and it was reflected everywhere in the empire, even the Imperial Harem. We do have to specify the Imperial Harem because harem can, in general, refer to the living spaces of women in all Turkish households, not just the sultans. A harem's privacy and lushness indicated the wealth of the man owning it. Indeed, even the number of wives a man could have was supposed to be limited to what he could afford, up to the maximum wife count of 4. A harem wouldn't just contain wives, however. Concubines, female relatives, female servants, and young children of both sexes also resided in the harem. The Imperial Harem was set up the same, only dialed to 11, with some imperial intrigue thrown in. And don't forget the fratricide. Can't have a glorious empire without fratricide. Ask the Romans. In the beginning of the empire, the harem was to serve one end goal: the continuation of the imperial line of Osman, specifically the patrilineal descent from the first emperor of the Ottoman Empire. The wives, concubines, and all their servants and protectors were there to make sure the Sultan had plenty of male children, so that one of them would prove worthy of the throne. And the competition for the succession was a matter of life and death. When a new sultan was crowned, his brothers would be killed to prevent civil wars and keep the Ottoman family tree more or less vertical. There is a vertical versus horizontal joke here we are too classy to make. Close thing though. The Imperial Harem had a hierarchy that was strictly enforced. The mother of the current sultan, the valide sultan, held authority over the harem. Her authority would sometimes extend out of the harem into the empire's politics, but legally her power ended at the harem's border. The women immediately below the valide sultan were the sultan's daughters. These princesses were valued because of their worth in political wrangling, ending in a marriage to a princess of royal lineage. The Ottomans transferred power through patriarchal lines, so even a royal wife would not give you royal children, a fact which was another component in the relative stability of the dynasty. Another group of women were the concubines of the Sultan, with their own sub-hierarchy. The wealth, prestige, and position of the concubines were dependent on their interactions with the Sultan. Those who never caught his eye were the lowest rung, servants to the more affluent. Next were those women who went to the Sultan's bed, but hadn't bore any children. It's worth noting that at the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, a wife or concubine could only have one male child of the emperor. Once that happened, she would stop coming to his bed. This was done to prevent two sons competing for their mother's support for the throne. The Sultan would have 4 Kadins, those who were considered his favorites. One among the Kadin would be the Bas Kadin, the first or most senior of the Kadins. As women climbed this hierarchy, they gained better housing, more money, and power. This brings us to an unfortunate and ugly truth of the Ottoman Empire. Although they are far from the only political entity to benefit from its practice, state-sanctioned slavery. The majority of the members of a sultan's harem would be slaves. From many places in and out of the empire, slave girls would be placed into the imperial harem if they were considered beautiful or talented enough. Often they were given as gifts from powerful leaders to the sultan. A girl or woman entering the harem would be trained and educated in the traditional structure of the harem, the tenets of Islam, and court etiquette. They would be given new names, usually reflecting their physical appearance or personality, and those that didn't know it were taught the Turkish language. While some would become cadins and valide sultan, most would be servants. And slavery didn't just target women, men were also enslaved and put to use in the imperial harem. This did require some extra steps, however. Besides the sultan and his sons, the only men to enter the harem were eunuchs. Eunuchs were separated by their origins into black and white eunuchs. The black eunuchs, and yes, the groups were based on skin color, had one set of duties and were even castrated a certain way. The white eunuchs had different duties and tended to be castrated differently, generally because they came to the Ottomans later in life than the African male slaves. The black eunuchs were often given roles more directly related to the harem, as their castration method left them much less likely to form any sort of relationship with the women. The Kisla Aga and the Kapi Aga, the black and white chief eunuchs respectively, worked closely with the sultan and were relatively powerful in the palace politics. The chief eunuchs would become involved in several court scandals and most infinitely the reign of women. A part of history we think could also be called Mommy Says. The reign of women, in Turkish Kadınlar Saltanati, would start with Suleiman the Magnificent and his wife and concubine Hurrem. Hurrem was a slave originating in the area belonging to modern-day Ukraine. She was smart, interesting, and gifted. So much so that she was the only concubine to marry the sultan and was considered to have great influence over Suleiman. Hurrem would give the sultan 4 sons, and after her first son was born, Suleiman would have no other children except those from Hurrem. She changed the power structure of the harem and the palace, which she convinced the sultan to move into a newer building. From then on, the Ottoman Empire, seated in the new Topkapi Palace, went through a period of less experienced and young sultans. The sultans would be pushed and pulled by harem and palace intrigue much more than previous rulers. The new sultans would spend more time in the palace and harem than their predecessors and would cease expanding the borders of the Ottoman Empire, focusing on internal problems and issues. The tradition of killing a sultan's brothers on his ascension was changed to perpetual imprisonment adjacent to the harem. So not exactly solitude and hardship, but a gilded cage is still a cage. Eventually, the entire royal family would sequester themselves in the royal palace. The population of the harem swelled to relatively enormous sizes. The chief eunuchs, valide sultans, and grand viziers all battled back and forth for subtle control of the sultan's ear. This period of Kadınlar Saltanati would stretch from Suleiman's reign in the early 1500s to almost the end of the 1600s. The imperial harem would lose influence over the politics of the empire, but would continue for as long as the Ottoman state existed. Over the next 2 centuries, the Ottomans would lose power and territory until the First World War, where they would suffer defeat when they allied with the Kaiser. After the war, the Ottoman Empire would cease and the Republic of Turkey would take its place. The history of the Sultan's harem is the story of the Ottomans, so intrinsically part of the empire that one can't be told without the other. While the women of the Ottoman Empire were in positions subservient to their male counterparts, they still were able to exert power and influence over the highest authority of the state. The concubines of the harem, enslaved and gathered from far distances, would give the empire new rulers and hold their own court, separate and secluded by law from the outside world. The Ottomans had great highs and lows. An institution of slavery and mutilation darkened their stretch of history. But they created a stable government that conquered a huge expanse of the ancient world and conquered one of the greatest cities built. Nothing like destroying the typical male fantasy to show the intricacies of history. Thanks for watching, and please look through our other videos and see what other surprising bits of history we talk about.